Hi and welcome back to the second lesson called Be a World-Class Calculator. As you may have guessed, here we'll talk about how to calculate practically and efficiently like the professionals do. Here's the first question. What do you need to have to calculate flawlessly and efficiently? You need three important skills: understanding, proper calculation technique, and visualization abilities. In the first lesson, we have seen that strategy and tactics are intertwined. It's a huge mistake to separate them. Your general understanding helps you a lot during the calculation. It shows you the moves that are worth calculating. It helps you to evaluate final positions. It helps you to compare different moves, and the list goes on. Many players make the common and huge mistake by trying to calculate variations mechanically. They pick out random moves and start calculating right away, without having any idea what they should aim for. We're not machines, and we should not imitate them. Well, unless you want to be like those players who sink their heads on their hands and try to calculate all the lines until the smoke comes from their ears. Well, we'll use a much more efficient method. We will use our general chess understanding to support our calculation and to bring it down to a minimum. Strategic understanding is so important even in variations that require tons of calculation. In light of that, I will not just give you the rules, but also explain them in so much detail. This will simplify your calculation task a lot. Moving forward to the second item on our list, calculation technique shows exactly how you should calculate efficiently. That's what we will analyze in this lesson. In order to be able to perform a calculation, you also need to have visualization skills. Later in this course, I will show you how you can develop your chess vision, which allows you to clearly see a position that's many moves ahead. But for now, let's focus on the calculation technique. The only thing most players really know about a calculation is the concept of candidate moves. No doubt, this is a useful idea. However, this is only a fraction of what it takes to efficiently calculate. Matter of fact, everything is much more complex. You will also find that, in some positions, it's even impossible to formulate a clear rule. It largely depends on a specific situation and its demands. Although a lot of players know about candidate moves, they keep making tactical mistakes constantly. This just goes to show that knowing about the concept of candidate moves is not enough. In this lesson, I'll show you the best modern techniques used by grandmasters. As promised in the previous lesson, we will formulate and analyze all the rules and techniques together. And of course, I'll show exactly how you should apply them in your own games. Okay, here we go. In general, the calculation method looks quite simple. I hope you're already familiar with that from my previous courses. First, you find the candidate moves. Secondly, you calculate each line and evaluate the final position resulting from the candidate move. And lastly, you compare these evaluations and choose the best one. As a whole, it's the correct approach, but in practice, there are many other things you need to know. For example, how do we find the appropriate candidate moves? How much time should we spend to calculate each line? How can you evaluate the final position precisely? What if you don't have a lot of time on the clock? And tons of other questions. So let's not waste any moment and let's answer them one after another. Here's the first question. When should we calculate variations? As I have mentioned in the previous lesson, generally tactics are about finding the best way to achieve your goal. Thus, you need to calculate when there is such a choice. As we already know, it becomes really crucial when there is contact between your and your opponent's pieces. Having said that, there can be two different situations when you need to calculate. First, when there is no contact between the pieces, and second, when there is such a contact. In both cases, first we need to think about strategy, our overall goal, and then find the tactics that lead to our objective. First, we need to understand our goal, and only after that we can think about the ways to achieve it. In other words, first you use your general understanding to find the most appropriate moves, and after that you need to check concrete variations. For both situations this is how it should go, however the accent or the emphasis is different. Situation 1. When there is no contact or tension between the pieces. Here you should mainly think about strategy and then quickly check variations. And the second situation, when there is a contact, then tactics becomes crucial. That said, you need to quickly review your overall strategy and spend most of your time calculating. Here is a sample position to clear things up. In this position there is a contact between the pieces, but it's not so intense. Not so many pieces attack each other. Thus White should mainly use his positional understanding to pick out the best move, and then quickly check variations to make sure it's tactically sound. According to the base strategic principles, the move bishop e3 should be the best. After that, we should check variations quickly. There are two main things you should pay attention to. First, we should check if there are other interesting options. While thinking about generalities, you can miss some odd-looking and paradoxical ideas that could lead to an advantage. That's why it's so important to check if there is something you might miss. In this position, however, White doesn't have any odd or interesting move available. Knight takes c6 doesn't lead to anything substantial for White, so we may finish this stage of our calculation. Now we're sure that the best move should be bishop e3. We should play it right away, correct? Wrong. Before playing a move, no matter how strategically motivated it is, you should check if it is tactically safe. This means you should calculate the opponent's aggressive replies. It's very important to perform such measures because it prevents blunders a lot. Let's run a blunder check for this position. We should quickly go through all of the opponent's pieces and think if he can move them forward and attack us. Okay, so let's make a move bishop e3. Okay, now with the queen, Black can play queen a5 check, but it's not dangerous because White can simply play knight c3. Along with that, Black can play queen b6, which might be unpleasant, so we need to look at that a little deeper. Upon closer inspection, we can see that it's not really dangerous for White. At least he can play knight b5, forcing the queen to go away, and then White will play knight 1 to c3 and White is doing fine. You see, there is no need for us to calculate everything. We just want to make sure that our move bishop e3 works and that it's not losing or dropping something. If Black is to play queen b6 in a game, then we will perform all of the necessary calculations. We will check knight f5, knight e6 and other moves that potentially can take advantage of Black's early queen excursion. But for now, it's not necessary. Okay, let's see if there's anything else Black can play. Looking at his rooks alone, Black has nothing. As for his bishop and knight, he can take on d4, but we will simply recapture. At last we can conclude that our move bishop e3 works well, it follows our fundamental principles and it's tactically sound. So after that, you may play it on the board. So White is playing bishop e3, and Black then replies knight f6. Now we can see a similar situation. There is a contact between the pieces, but again, it's not too much. Once more, we will make a decision based on our general understanding, and after that we'll check the variations and the move soundness quickly. Following the fundamental principles, the move knight c3 should be the best. It keeps our e4 pawn defended while developing an inactive piece. Following that, we should calculate variations quickly. First, let's check if there is anything else which can be interesting for white. We can see an idea knight takes c6 following with e5. However, in this position it doesn't work because black will answer queen a5 check, winning a pawn in the process. Still, white should have checked this idea. In this position it does not work, but who knows, in some other position it could work well. Strategically, the move knight takes c6 is bad, it releases the tension. That's why you might miss it while looking for moves that are strategically sound. And that's why you should make quick check of this variation now. As we can conclude, knight c3 is the only logical move for white. But, as we have discussed earlier, before playing this move, we should check if it works. We must check eventual aggressive replies of our opponent. Okay, with the queen, black can play queen b6. But as we already know, at least white can play knight b5. Thus it's not dangerous for white. With his rooks and bishops, black doesn't have anything really threatening. With a knight, black can take on d4, but we will simply recapture. With another knight, black can play knight g4. However, it doesn't look so much dangerous because at least white can take the knight. Black will play knight d4, threatening fork onto c2, but white has many ways to cover it. White can play bishop d3, castle away to safety, or at the very least play back queen d1. Once more, there is no need for white to calculate all these lines now. We only want to ensure that our move knight c3 does not drop material. Now that we are sure about it, we should really play knight c3. Now let's say black indeed plays knight g4, and this really creates a tactical position where there is a lot of contact and tension between the pieces. Many pieces are attacking each other. It means that here we will mainly rely on a calculation. First, we should briefly look at the general features of the position, and after that, we should focus on a calculation. Generally speaking, knight g4 should not be too dangerous for white. White did not make any mistake and his position shouldn't be bad. Along with that, white doesn't want to allow black to capture the bishop. That said, probably white needs to take on g4. And that's about it. Our examination of the generalities was very quick. Next, we should calculate concrete variations thoroughly. The candidate moves are certainly knight takes c6 and queen takes g4. In both lines, black has a few possible replies. For instance, after knight takes c6, black can take on e3 or recapture on c6 with b or d pawn. And white needs to calculate this whole tree of variations. After calculating all of the resulting variations, white can compare the end positions and pick the best one. Once more, let me emphasize, when there is a lot of contact between the pieces, we must mainly rely on a calculation. Now let's make a quick summary of what we have discussed. There are two possible situations. First, when there is no contact between the pieces, and second, when there is such a contact or tension. When there is no contact, you should apply your general understanding to find the best move, and then quickly check the resulting variations. This implies two things. Check if you have any other interesting candidate moves, and check if your move is sound by looking at the possible aggressive replies of your opponent. To put it briefly, your system of thinking for strategic positions, when there is no contact between the pieces, should be: first, apply your general understanding to find the best move. Second, check if you have any other interesting candidate moves. And third, check if your following move works well. If you don't have much time on the clock, you may skip the second step. The first and third steps, however, are obligatory even in Blitz. They ensure that you make good moves and you do not make blunders. Remember, it only takes one bad move, one blunder to ruin a game that's been well played for 40 moves. Okay, moving forward, let's now summarize the ideal chess thought process in tactical positions, when there is a contact between the pieces. First, just like before, you need to look at the generalities of the position. Do the first step quickly. Evaluate opponent's move and think what you want to do in general. After that, you should calculate variations. Find all the candidate moves first and calculate them one after another. Perhaps this sounds a bit complex and long-winded to you, but in fact everything is very simple. With consistent practice, this should eventually be as easy as breathing. Remember the sequence. First we use our strategic understanding, and secondly we calculate the variations. In tactical positions, we put stress on the second step. In calm positions, we focus on the first step mainly. Okay, so far we analyzed when to start calculating variations. Now let's move on to the next question. How to find the candidate moves? In other words, how do we find the moves that worth calculating? As we have discussed, tactics help us find the best way to achieve our general goal. Of course, we should not calculate everything, but only the moves that take us in the appropriate direction. Let your opponent to calculate everything. Once more, strategic understanding will help us bring our calculation work down to minimum. You should calculate only the logical moves, those which lead to your strategic goal. And what should be your goal? Your main goal is to gain activity. And there are several strategic principles that will guide you to achieve it. First, you should try to attack. Doing so pushes the opponent's pieces back while we improve our piece's activity. If there are no attacking possibilities for us, then we should aim to increase our activity or decrease opponents. I examined these principles in great detail in my previous courses. That said, first you should calculate attacking moves. They are the most powerful. A well-played attacking move could lead to a quick knockout, so it makes sense to invest time in finding and calculating such moves. Furthermore, it is simpler to calculate forcing moves practically. If you make an ordinary move, your opponent can answer with any move, and it will be hard for you to calculate all of these lines. If you make an attacking move, you force an opponent to defend. Thus you'll need to calculate only this one line. This explains why it's so convenient to calculate forcing moves. The forcing moves are checks, captures, and attacking moves. The check is the most forcing move. Your opponent is obliged to do something about his king, defend it or move it away. Captures are also quite forcing. In most cases, your opponent has to recapture in reply. However, when the situation calls for it, he may ignore it, sacrifice a pawn or a piece, and that's why a check is more forcing and needs to be calculated first. Attacking moves usually force an opponent to defend. However, there are situations where an opponent may sacrifice material or store up counter threats. That's why it's the last in the list of forcing moves. As a little conclusion, first you should consider forcing moves. If you cannot attack, then you need to increase your activity or decrease opponents. Here you need to consider the moves that follow base fundamental principles of chess: maximum activity, neutralization, and so on. Okay, Now let's sum up a conclusion about candidate moves. We should calculate only the logical moves. More precisely, it means first of all forcing moves, check, capture and attack, and secondly moves that follow base strategic principles, maximum activity, neutralization, and so on. Take a look at the following position. What are the candidate moves for white here? Please pause the video and think about it on your own first. Okay, first we should consider forcing moves. Knight f6 check, and captures knight takes e5 and knight takes b6. Lastly, there is a logical move that follows the base principles. It's rook c1, because it saves the material, the c6 pawn. All in all, we have 4 candidate moves to calculate and evaluate. First we will calculate forcing moves. If one of them works, we'll play it. If none of them works, we'll make a normal move rook c1. As you can see, our system of chess thought process is universal. It helps us to find combinations as well as normal logical moves. In the current position, the sudden move knight takes b6 works. After pawn takes, and then rook d8 check, white will promote his c pawn soon. For example, if black goes rook e8, white can take, and then go c7. Now black is defenseless against rook d8. Here is another example, and it's white's turn in this position. Once again, I want you to perform a little task. Please pause the video now and find all candidate moves for white. First, we should think about forcing moves. There are no checks at the moment. As for the capture, there is a move bishop takes e6, but it obviously doesn't give anything. After f takes e6, nothing really changed in the position except that white lost a bishop. Therefore, there are no logical captures in this position. However, we have several attacking moves. Queen e3, attacking the rook, e5, f5, and maybe knight e5 using a beam. By the way, how can we find attacking moves? Here is how to get the job done. Look at the opponent's half of the board and think how you can move your pieces forward onto that territory and take or attack something. Once we're done finding the attacking moves, we should look at logical moves that follow base chess principles. Here there is one such move, rook he1, which brings the least active piece into a game. Thus in total there are 5 candidate moves. Queen e3, knight e5, e5, f5 and rook he1. We will not analyze this game until the end because now we're focusing on finding the candidate moves solely. Okay, I hope that you now understand how to find candidate moves. You need to consider forcing moves, and after that look for moves that follow fundamental chess principles. I'd like to make one additional clarification about forcing moves. At this stage of thinking, it's very important to turn off your human bias. Let's take a look at one of our previous examples again. Here we looked at the candidate moves knight takes f6, knight e5 and knight b6. Now, of course, they all look very bad. They seem to drop material for no apparent compensation. However, this is a typical situation and it is completely normal. When looking at attacking moves, you try to do something on opponent's territory. This territory is controlled by opponent's forces, and most of your moves towards that area will simply lose the material. However, sometimes such an attacking move will work well and if it does, it shatters your opponent's position. This is why it's so important to consider forcing moves even if they look bad. You just need to admit that most of your forcing candidate moves will not work, and it's fine. At this stage of thinking, we only want to discover all interesting possibilities. Later you will calculate them and will detect which moves work and which not. Again, do not allow your prejudice to restrict your calculation. Turn off your human bias for a moment. Consider all of the forcing moves, including those that look terrible. Most of them will not work, but when they do, they have the power to bring you an immediate win. This happened in the current position where one of the white's sudden forcing moves, knight takes b6, brought him an immediate win. If you studied my previous chess courses and free lessons, you may have noticed an odd situation. On one hand, I encourage you to calculate forcing moves first of all. But on the contrary, I've told you that to take is a mistake and you need to keep the tension. So you may be wondering, should I break the tension or not? Should I take or not? Well, let me clarify it. In general, you should keep the tension, that's right. A release of tension usually helps your opponent to increase his activity. However, sometimes capturing can give you a concrete tactical advantage. For instance, you can win material. If that is the case, if capturing brings you a concrete tactical benefit, then you should do it. Otherwise, you should keep the tension. Take a look at the following position. We have seen it before. Should white take on c6 here or not? In general, we should keep the tension. Releasing of tension usually helps your opponent to become more active. In this position, the exchange knight takes c6 and b takes will open a b file for black and will strengthen his center. Therefore, knight takes c6 is a strategic mistake for white. Nevertheless, white should calculate this move because it's a forcing move. Potentially, it can give white a certain tactical benefit, so white need to check it. In the current position, black gains something from the release of tension and white has nothing to show for it. The follow-up e5 is refuted by queen a5, and that's why indeed knight takes c6 is a mistake here for white, it does not work. Now let's move on to another position. Here we have another theoretical position. Again, knight takes c6 is in the cards, and, matter of fact, it makes sense. After an exchange and e5 move, black either has to go back, knight g8, or give up a pawn after knight d5. In both cases, white gets a concrete tactical benefit. Therefore, in this position, an exchange knight takes c6 makes sense for white. To conclude this section, first of all, we need to calculate all of the forcing moves we have: checks, captures, and attacking moves. Releasing the tension is good if you have a forcing continuation that leads to a concrete advantage. If it does not, it's bad and you should keep the tension instead. Okay, so far we discussed how to find those candidate moves and what are they. Now I'll show you exactly how you should do it in practice. Okay, as we have discussed before, we should identify all of our forcing moves as well as moves that follow fundamental chess principles. At first glance, it's not that simple to detect all of the candidate moves that fit into our criteria. It looks really complex. As far as forcing moves and moves that follow fundamental principles are concerned, white has plenty options and almost any move is possible. How do we deal with this situation? That's exactly what I will show you. What follows is how you should think when playing a game. Please pay careful attention to this, as this is precisely the calculation method you should use in practice. Here is a very important point. You should focus your attention on every single piece and pawn you have one by one, starting from the piece with the highest value, the next one in the sequence, and so on. Look at the possible moves of your king, then have a look at your queen, rooks, bishops, knights, and pawns. Trying to find all of the candidate moves right off the bat in a complex position like this is very difficult. However, when you partition this task into bit-sized portions, looking at the candidate moves for one piece then the next, it becomes way easier. This is how you can split one massive and hard task into several easy-to-do tasks. Now let's see the method in action. I've told you that first you should consider the moves of your king. However, that usually happens in the endgame positions. In the opening and middle game stages, we simply keep our king in a safe and sound position. With that in mind, most often you'll start thinking of the queen moves. Okay, what candidate moves has white for his queen? We're looking for forcing and logical moves only. It usually means that we should go forward or at least move around the same rank. As much as possible, we don't want to move back, as that will reduce our activity. Okay, in the diagonal c4 a6 she has no logical moves. The same can be said with the other diagonal c4 c6. True, white can take on e6. This looks silly, but we again should still consider it for several seconds. Remember, we need to consider all forcing moves, including those which look bad. In this position, queen takes c6, knight takes obviously doesn't lead to anything, so we can dismiss it. In conclusion, with the queen we don't have any candidate moves. Next we should take a look at our rooks. The f1 rook can go forward really, and there are no logical moves it can play. The e1 rook on the other hand can take on e4. It looks like a bad idea, but again we should think about it since it's a forcing move. After rook takes and knight takes, white can recapture by the knight, but it doesn't create any threats and white ends up down in exchange. If white takes by the pawn instead, he creates some sort of attack against the f7 square, but at least black can take bishop takes e5 and stop white's f7 assault. Therefore it should be dismissed, and this means there are no candidate moves for the white's e1 rook. Moving down the ladder, we should focus our attention on the bishop. What forward and forcing moves it can play? Bishop h4 looks interesting. It creates a pin, increases the pressure, so it's a candidate move. Okay, now we should look at our other options. What can white do with his c3 knight? It can take the e4 pawn, and it's a forcing and logical move, so this is an option. Or what about another knight on e5? What forcing and logical moves can it play? It has 3 forcing moves forward, and we should quickly consider them all. Knight takes c6 and b takes only loses a knight, not good. However, knight takes f7 is interesting. After king takes, the rook is pinned, white can use the f file to attack black's king, so this is worth looking at. And knight takes g6 is also interesting. After f takes, it also creates a pin, opens the black's king, and again we have a move worth considering. Finally, we come to the pawn moves. Which forcing and logical moves does white have with his pawns? d5 is an taken move, but at least black can take the knight, getting 2 minor pieces for the rook, and I don't think it's good for white. F takes e4 is a candidate move. and with the g pawn white can play g5 or take on h5. Finally, we have listed all of the candidate moves that white has in this complex position. There are quite a lot of them. Bishop h4, knight takes f7, knight takes g6, knight takes e4, and pawn moves f takes e4, g5 and gh5. 7 moves in total. Although the position is very complicated, we were able to find all candidate moves, and more importantly, we did not miss anything. It happened because we focused our attention on every single piece one by one. This is how we should split one hard task to several simple tasks. And of course, this idea of moving your pieces forward in search for forcing and logical moves is also very helpful. First of all, we should consider the moves that go forward the most. If you're white, then look and consider moves towards the 8th rank, then to the 7th rank, to the 6th rank, and so on. Let's find the candidate moves here for white in this position. The queen is attacked, and black is threatening queen g4 check. This narrows down white's options. The white's king, queen and rook f1 have no logical moves. The f6 rook can check rook g6 check, and also white can capture the rook d takes e4. These are 2 moves white has here. First, we should consider the most forcing move, a check, rook g6. Now black must take with his f-pawn to cover the g7 square. Here white needs to find candidate moves again. First we need to focus our attention on the queen and think what forward and forcing moves it can play. We should look at the most forward squares first. h8, then g7, f6, e5. If you follow this way, you'll easily find queen h8 move, which mates black on the next move. King takes and rook takes a fate. In the same manner, if you're considering rook moves, then first think about the most forward moves with the rook. Rook f8, then rook f7, rook f6, and so on. That's how this process should be mentally performed. Okay, you've just received a lot of new information. It'll be useful to take a short break. After that, I'll be waiting for you in the second part of this lesson.